Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. My name is Christy Lazicki, and I'm the Senior Impact Evaluation Advisor with HIAC, which stands for the Humanitarian Assistance Evidence Cycle. And the goal of this new award is to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of emergency food security activities funded by the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance by increasing the use of cost-effective and timely impact evaluations in humanitarian context. But I'd like to welcome you today to this session entitled Using Humanitarian Evaluations for Development Programs in HDP Coherence. This session is the third of the second thematic area of Ideal's knowledge sharing series, Data for Decision Making in HDP Coherence. Before we start, we'd like to inform you that this session will be recorded and that we're providing simultaneous interpretation in French. And I'd like to invite everyone to select the preferred language for this session. You can do so by clicking interpretation, the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting either English or French. And you can choose to mute the original audio or listen to it at a lower volume. At any time during the event, if you have questions or comments, please use the chat box feature. And today we'll be exploring how evaluations of humanitarian programs can offer critical insights for future response, relief, and recovery efforts, as well as longer-term activities. This session will be a dynamic dialogue with M&E practitioners with experience across the humanitarian and development sectors. And following the conversation, we will encourage you all to share your own experiences and collectively help us think through what could be the enablers to some of the challenges encountered in the field. I'm glad now to introduce our session's host, Mara Mordini, who is an M&E advisor with the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. And Mara will be joined by Fabio Becerra, an evaluation manager at Unicef in Mozambique, and Gary Glass, who is the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation at Bluemont. Over to you, Mara.
Thanks, Christy. Good morning, everyone. Good evening. I see in the chat box we have some people who are on the same time zone as Christy and Gary, so they are up very early to join us. And then it looks like we have somebody calling in at about dinner time on the other side of the world. So welcome, everyone. Just as we get started, it might be helpful to you to understand the kinds of experience that the panel brings. As Christy said, I'm an M&E advisor at USAID with BHA. My portfolio comprises providing M&E backstop to BHA's programs in Uganda, as well as, and I would say my primary role is managing the Impel Award, which is Implementer-Led Evaluation and Learning. And that does the baselines and evaluations of our RFSAs, our Resilience Food Security activities. I also work with a colleague of mine on the HIAC Award, which is helping to bring this to you today. Fabio, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself? Over.
Sure, thank you, Mara. So I'm Fabio. I'm currently working in Unicef Mozambique, and as presented before, I'm responsible for managing all the evaluations here for the country office. So that means evaluations related either to humanitarian interventions or development interventions. And alongside with that, I also support building internal capacity of all our program staff to better understand demand and also use evidence that comes from evaluation, as well as the government partners that work with us in these interventions, or just to naturally nurture and increase the national evaluation capacity. I think over to Gary now.
Thanks, Fabio. Yeah, so my name is Gary Glass, and over at Bluemont, I work with all of our field teams across the globe, from Colombia to Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, pretty much everywhere we go. And it's as much as leading some of the evaluation design with our teams, all the way to supporting external consultants and then supporting third-party teams that are brought in by the donors to evaluate our programs. So everything from design, analytics, data interpretation, and reporting. Just depends on what each country's specific needs are. That's what my team and I are there to support.
Great, thanks. And just to get this session off, kick it off with a little bit of a softball pitch. Let's talk about the importance of evaluating humanitarian assistance awards. And I think coming from the donor side, we are interested in accountability to stakeholders. We're looking at gauging the effectiveness of a program. So speaking to its performance, and of course, learning for the purposes of adaptation and future programming. So not something that is specific to humanitarian awards necessarily, crosses the gamut for our resilience and disaster risk rewards. So from my perspective, I think we're really interested in how things are going and why they're going and what we can learn from them. Do either of you have any other perspectives about the importance of evaluating these kinds of programs? Fabio, let's start with you again.
Sure. I think first and foremost, we need to take into consideration that in a humanitarian context, the stakes of inaction are greater than in a developmental setting. And with that, decisions do not always result from the most well thought and in-depth kind of planning process. So I would say that evaluations in this context is even more important because it really helps to course correct implementation throughout these interventions and increase the potential benefits to those in need. On the other hand, as well, humanitarian crisis and its effects do not really end right after its acute phase. So we'll transition to recovery, we'll transition to resilience, and really try to bridge with development planning later. And these long-term interventions, they are really needed to help close this gap in well-being that's created by this crisis. And in that way, evaluations done at a humanitarian phase of a humanitarian phase and stage will help understand which are these gaps and also what is the potential for change in whatever strategies were experimented by the implementing partners, by those that were developing the policies.
And Gary, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad both of you brought those points up because we're responsible to implement according to both BHA and the UN's guidelines because we are implementing partners for both of those types of awards. But for our side, it's first to make sure that anything that we implement, we want to understand the successes and failures for potential follow-on programming and also to correct any kind of issues that we have in country because we do have programs running simultaneously in the same countries. So that's definitely a point that we care a lot about. One of the other things is to evaluate these humanitarian programs and make sure that any issues or successes that we have are able to be shared across IPs in the same country. Hopefully people can learn from our successes and our failures. And then I guess finally the main point would just be, we really just want to make sure that anything that we're doing on the humanitarian side can be used to inform future development programming. Kind of what Fabio was saying is that as a country progresses out of that emergency situation, anything that's learned during the humanitarian evaluation should and can be used to inform the design of development programming in the future.
Thanks. Yep. And that's, kind of the purpose of of us coming together today to brainstorm and chat about this. Gary, you mentioned sharing the information within the country, and what venues, what mediums, how does that happen? Does it happen enough? And any thoughts on how to encourage that, perhaps in any of the countries that Blumont's working in?
So does it happen enough? I guess I could be very blunt and say no. I don't think it happens as much as it should. And I don't think there will ever be a time where it happens to the point where I personally am like, yes, we've done it. We're there. No, I think that's an ongoing effort that everyone, and I mean this across the board, IPs, donors, everyone needs to work collaboratively to improve across the board. But what we do have now, some examples of evaluation results sharing is working groups in certain countries and different operating contexts where different IPs come together. Those are usually sector specific. So you might have a WASH working group, you might have a shelter and settlement working group, and those are oftentimes designed to determine certain criteria for implementation standards across the humanitarian sector and those specific sectors. So that's an area where that's probably the best venue I can think of for regional or country specific information sharing. But again, those are very much dependent on the members of those working groups and how well they function with each other and what systems they have in place. So there's nothing really standard across the board that allows for this type of sharing that we're talking about.
Thanks. Fabio, anything to add to that?
I was just going to exemplify, I think, when we're talking about course correction, one recent example I have that comes to mind here in Mozambique during the COVID crisis, the Unicef and WFP social protection teams came together with the government and designed an intervention that was a cash plus intervention to respond to immediate needs. And the efforts that we had to gather evidence of what was working and not was helped to improve coordination and stronger definition of roles from an early setting of this implementation, but also improve identification and registration mechanisms that later can be used for the social protection government system in itself. So it's something that allows for quick shifts and quick changes while the emergencies happen, while we're trying to reach the most vulnerable people, but at the same time, the learnings and the lessons from these evaluations and these reflections, they can really feed into more systematic and system strengthening activities later on.
And that sort of is a nice segue to explore the next question a little further, which is how can we build from these programs and the results from these evaluations for development programming purposes? And when I reflected upon the question and chatted with a colleague on this, what we thought was that, there are transferable interventions, if you will, and that could be cash or voucher programming, maybe even behavior change messaging, that what is learned from perhaps a process or an approach in an emergency setting through an evaluation could be useful in a transition period to a development program, just because something as fundamental as cash and voucher distributions, there's something to be learned there, that it's cross-cutting. Gary, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or any examples of your emergency evaluations feeding into another development activity going on in country, be it USAID funded, DFID funded, World Bank, or something. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Mara. There are three parts or three opportunities that can be included in any evaluation in a humanitarian context that could feed into development programming in the future. The one commonality is always people, right? So if we're looking at the household structure, the community structure and those support systems that exist there, and then if you can include atmospherics, like the type of resources that are available in a given location, if you can get detailed information in your evaluation about those contextual conditions, that can be very helpful to informing development programming in the future, because you're obviously going to evaluate whatever programming you just completed, and then now you have the context for how and why those things happened. So if you can answer those questions, and then as a country progresses or a situation becomes more stable, it allows for those development programming, those development practitioners to come in, use the humanitarian evaluations to better inform the decisions they make around future programming. And hopefully they come in prepared and, well, not prepared, but as well prepared as possible, given the context that they're working in, to truly create useful and life-changing programming that allows people to, generate livelihoods and things like that.
Fabio, any thoughts on your side?
Sure. I think it's also important to acknowledge that a crisis response is not really sequential. So in a way, while the immediate activities are happening to address those that have immediate needs, at the same time, there are teams that are working and thinking, how can we create solutions, thinking about recovery, thinking about resilience, how can we strengthen systems so whatever we start building here with the immediate response can be long lasting and can then lead to improvement in well-being for this population. So in that sense, information that comes out of evaluations at an early stage can feed into this planning for a longer term type of intervention. And thinking about examples here, for instance, talking about the same intervention that we had on social protection during COVID here in Mozambique. During the evaluations, we had to conduct some sort of vulnerability assessments, and analysis on how the targeting and appropriateness of the intervention were done. And these exercises, of course, help then to identify, are we leaving people behind? Who are the people that we left behind, or who are those that would require even a stronger approach that was not able to be performed during the emergency stage of the response. So this then feeds to how can we strengthen the social protection mechanism in the country? How can we expand ongoing projects and programs that, for example, there is a child grant that's run by the government, there is a disability grant that's run by the government. And then are these people that we were able to find through the evaluation in the emergency, are they covered already? Are they being considered? And if not, could they be then included? So I think there is a quite clear connection on understanding better the population, understanding better their vulnerabilities, and making sure that we're connecting those with the long-term interventions.
Okay, I guess kind of trailing from that, Fabio, I'm interested in whether either of you have any examples of effective sharing of evaluation findings between humanitarian and development practitioners. And, it can go either way. Like, do you have any emergency evaluations that have gone into development programming? And Fabio, you spoke a little bit about going into the government and feeding into their social protection programs. But also we can talk about any sort of development programming helping to provide, Gary, as you were referencing, sort of the context information or other data that we may have that could be used and leveraged. Kind of wondering, BHA programs in recurrent crisis situations. So we have plenty of awards that feed into one another in emergency settings. But then we also have situations where in DRC or in Haiti, there is that coexistence of, there is a coexistence of emergency and development programming, but also there's that intentional effort to try to layer or sequence integrate, to use some of our buzzwords at aid and broader community. But do we have examples of effective use of evaluations to inform such programming? And do you have anything that you can speak of to that?
You want to jump in first, Gary?
Sure, why not? No problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I can give a brief example of, so it's not necessarily across different interventions or landscapes. It's different countries with the same population. So if we have some of our humanitarian evaluations that we've completed on internally displaced persons in Syria, and some of the livelihoods programming that we have in Jordan for Syrian refugees. Some of those information, some of those data that we have from the Syrian evaluations in Syria can be used to understand that population's social structures, their helping networks, their professional capacity, and things like that, that we then can carry over to the Jordanian context with that same population and try to design vocational training opportunities and livelihoods opportunities that once they're out of that emergency context, what's next. And a lot of that comes from us having a better understanding of the people that we're working to support. But we can't always get that, until, it's faster for us to get it and more efficient if we get it from the humanitarian side and carry it over to the development side. And that's one of the opportunities that we've identified within our own programming, and that's actually across different donors. So it can be used. It just depends on kind of what your opportunities are, and it's while it is the same population, the different context, you definitely have to account for the operating environments and the context that they're living in. That just because you know about the same population in two different places, it doesn't mean it's going to exactly translate, perfectly. So there's a lot of confounding factors that we have to account for in using humanitarian evaluation data for development programming with the same population in a different country.
Thanks, Gary. I think that when I was talking to some people about this session, that is that could be a frequent hang up, right? Oh, what worked here won't work here. It's a different population, totally different setting, environment, whatnot. It's not transferable, it's not relevant. And I think we need to perhaps broaden and allow space for the fact that there could be applicability, it could be transferable, because I think we need to be using the evidence and the learning that we have and considering how can we apply it. You were talking about evaluations, I think you were saying in Syria, and then making it usable for programming in Iraq. And I just wanted to ask, what kinds of evaluations has Bluemont been using as it's been programming across these countries and trying to take the learning with you? I mean, maybe not even across countries, but from maybe one area of a country to another. Tell me a little bit about the methods, as well as the kinds of evaluations.
So they're more or less performance evaluations. Oftentimes it's with an external consultant, where awards require that. And in other cases, they're just internal evaluations because they're not actually required by the donor. We just want to do it to make sure we know what the heck is going on. Frankly, it's that simple. But a lot of times we are reliant on quarterly surveys, usually to test the atmospheres of, to capture the atmospherics and perceptions of what's going on amongst these certain populations. And then we try to go ahead and then explain that through different types of interviews. Oftentimes in the operating environments that we have in Northeast Syria, extended amounts of time and gathering groups for focus group discussions is absolutely not possible. So sticking with, especially within camps, camp settings, have pretty substantial limitations on what we can and can't do. And that comes up to camp administration for access. But it's almost always, or at least I try to push a mixed methods explanatory design. So we're using qualitative data to explain the quantitative findings and actually tell the story behind the numbers. But that's oftentimes what we try to do as a standard.
Great. I think, you referenced performance evaluations, and I think that process evaluations can be just as useful and there's a space for them in these kinds of, in the transition and trying to apply learning from one country or one program in another in country or in a different setting, because process evaluations allow us to look at the implementation aspect of it and how things are being done. Is it being done well, properly? Is this approach useful versus maybe trying something else someplace else? So I think sometimes we may get caught up with, oh, there is a certain type of evaluation that we do at Endline. It's a performance evaluation typically, but there are other kinds of evaluations that we can sprinkle in throughout a program, that it doesn't have to be a final evaluation, and that learning that we transfer and we share. There are other kinds of evaluations that can be informative. Fabio, do you have any examples that you want to share about effective sharing of learning across these contexts?
Sure, Mara. And what you were just saying about how we learn in different ways, I think it's quite important when we're looking at evaluations and how to bridge the HDP nexus. First, I think you started talking about how we can learn from process, and I think we should also try to understand and look a little bit further and with a broader view of how we plan the evaluations. Not only how we plan the interventions, but how we plan the evaluations, how these decisions are made. So what is leading us to use a certain methodology? What is directing us to involve more or less people, to have a shorter or a longer feedback loop? What type of products? How are we communicating using these findings? And I think if we have a very well documented evaluation process and management in itself, and we share also the lessons that we get from these reflections, this could be very useful for other people that are thinking about how they are going to evaluate their interventions, and then understanding what may or may not work in certain conditions. So to be more specific, for example, we had a real-time evaluation of Cyclone Idai here in Mozambique, 2019. And it was a multi-country evaluation because the cyclone just went ripping through, started in Mozambique, but also touched Malawi and continue inland. And it was a multi-country, but also multi-agency kind of intervention and government. So it was quite complex. And lots of lessons regarding the coordination, the data collection mechanisms, the reporting and the feedback loops helped then us to think how we could do a real-time evaluation, for example, of the COVID response done by social protection colleagues. Then we tried to adapt to this, but then as the emergency itself was different and the program was different and the way that the partners were working were different, we couldn't quite transport all the solutions from that first experience to the second one. We ended up not doing a real-time evaluation, but we did an extensive evaluability assessment that then fed to a summative type of review. So just to say that these experiences of understanding why couldn't we do it, was it that we didn't have enough data, we didn't have enough documentation about the program, or we couldn't mobilize enough people and get enough support for the evaluation to be embedded in programmatic activities for researchers to have a direct channel of communication to gather more information and then to respond to the needs of and and reflections of the implementation team. So I think this is also a way that we can use and share information between humanitarian and also development interventions. And the other way, if I have one more minute, is just to think more broadly as well. How can we do planning in a more integrated manner? So how can we start thinking about strategies, especially for organizations or governments that are not only looking at humanitarian context, not only at development context, but they really see the population that is affected is the same. So they want to have a more kind of holistic and integrated solution. And in that way, we had an interesting example here as well in Unicef in Mozambique. Very good timing when we were just finishing the country program. So after 5 years and we conducted the evaluation of the country program, we had just the declaration that the emergency we have in the north of the country, it's a conflict, internal conflict that is happening in northern provinces. It was declared a level 2 emergency. So that triggered an evaluation of that, our humanitarian response as well. So we had one development evaluation, one big humanitarian evaluation coming together, and the opportunity of planning a new country program. So you can imagine that the lessons from these two were very, very useful in a way that we were able to not only develop the country program, but as recommendation of both evaluations also have a specific community recovery and resilience plan for the North. And this plan, it tries really to merge these two views through system strengthening humanitarian interventions, but also agile and flexible recovery and resilience building. It develops on all the life cycle approach on children's rights. So it really is a way, since we had actors from both humanitarian response and development programs coming together to reflect on these evaluations throughout its process. They were empowered, the ownership of the findings was there as well, and it was way easier to come up with a kind of strategy that unified all these views.
Thank you for those examples. I think it's something I'd be interested also to hear from the audience if they have any examples of such coordination, either taking information from one evaluation and sharing it with a different partner in the region, or is it even something that's in-house even better? We have this learning from these evaluations and we have used it for, it has fed into our plan for our development program. One thing I think of when I think about BHA starting their RIFSAs in areas like Haiti or DRC is that we know there's such an extensive amount of emergency responders, and wondering, is there a way, is there an opportunity for those evaluations and learning from those programs to support new RIFSA awardees with any of the questions they may have, either on understanding the context better, learning from evaluations on were vouchers effective in these areas, if not why. And I wonder if, you know, we have this year-long refinement period where there's a lot of research being done, and I hope that our RIFSA awardees are reaching out to the partners in country who are proximate to where they're programming to see if they can learn anything. And you know, I'm hopeful that our evaluation partners are also willing and interested in sharing that information with them. On that note, is there a culture of information sharing across the development and humanitarian organizations? And we touched on this a little bit at the start of this conversation, but we have the opportunity now to do a little bit of a deeper dive. BHA, through awards and with the help of our partners such as TOPS or IDEAL, we facilitate these knowledge sharing workshops and knowledge sharing events that can provide a venue and an opportunity for such exchange. And I think one other aspect I'd like to touch on that I was just mentioning, but I would really hope that within our partner organizations, it's not always just sharing across, but it is within. Do you guys have any thoughts on the culture? And maybe we can dive into this a bit. Over.
Fabio, you want me to do it? You want to do it?
I can start and be brief, and then I think you're more connected. You can give more examples. But
No
I would say that regarding sharing, I think there's a lot of material out there. So we have multiple forums, we have loads of events, webinars such as this as well. If you go onto Relief Web and you look for reports, if you go to the Ideal platform, if you go to 3IE, you'll have loads of evaluations and meta-analysis and all of those. Unicef itself has an extensive database on evaluations that were conducted both in humanitarian and development settings. However, I would like to bring to the table not the availability only, but how we use this load of information, because it often seems to be disconnected, the evidence from the planning process. And of course, I understand that there are challenges here. It's not only because people don't want to do, sometimes it may be a lack of preparedness, kind of contingency work. When we're talking about the humanitarian setting, this can be either due to lack of funding or lack of human resources to be able to just sit and think through what we could do in case an emergency, we have an outbreak somewhere. It's also, to be very realistic, a competition for funds. So sometimes we don't want to just divulge things very much in the opens, because we're afraid that other people may learn and just capture the funds that we're trying to apply for. However, this is contradictory, because the essence of our work is to be replicable and just help and develop everywhere as much as we can, right? But also, I think internally, we have a low priority given to the L in MEL. So I think we do a lot of monitoring, we do a lot of evaluation, but when it comes to learning and that feedback loop and that openness to criticism, organizational culture really needs to change. And I hope that those that are here participating with us can bring some examples of good practices of what they have observed in their organizations, and perhaps good ways that they found to really nurture this kind of critical conscience and openness to reflect on what was done, on how we can improve, and learning from failure, really identifying, being okay with failing, and knowing that you only improve once you find what's wrong with what you're doing.
Thanks, Fabio. And I know we've spoken about all those things. So yeah, that's none of that is it should be a surprise to anyone. And I think there's definitely room for improvement across both across IPs within our own organization and within donor organizations, and the relationship between donor and IP. There's a lot of room for improvement in that culture of information sharing, especially across development humanitarian organizations. One of the things that Fabio mentioned that I completely agree with is the sort of fear of failure. And I know it can also be, it's basically are evaluations being used to just check boxes, or are they being used to truly learn from? And how are we going to go ahead and improve the sharing of that? Yeah, within IPs, sure, there's a need to maintain a competitive advantage to go after new funding, absolutely. But that should not preclude us from truly learning from each other and actually using the information that we're gathering, because a lot of us work in the similar operating environments. We're competing for funding in the same country, in the same sectors, and that should not be a reason to prevent improvement across different programming to genuinely support and help the populations that were there, to support and help. So so to answer your question quite simply, Mara, is I don't think there's a lack of information sharing across the board. And I think learning is something we absolutely need to improve upon. And that's Bloom on as well. Everyone needs to be working more to kind of put the fear of failure aside, and the competition is always going to be there for going after new funds, but that doesn't mean that service delivery has to be hampered or we can't improve what we're doing just because of those reasons. And that's something that to make sure that we're not just doing the basics to check a box, but we're actually doing things that are useful and are going to generate actionable learnings for everyone to use.
Yeah, I think oh, go ahead, Fabio.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can I throw some, I don't know, oxygen in the fire a little bit? Just reflecting as well, especially I think in the humanitarian setting, when we really need to be fast about developing the interventions, and when normally there is a big competition for funds, and also there's sometimes lots of conditionalities and some kind of rigid schemes for applications and for certain grants. I think it's also time to involve the donors in these discussions about how we innovate and how we learn from these innovations. So sometimes I believe that people do not seek more sharing of information or seek evidence when they are at the planning stage of the interventions, because they also feel a little bit trapped in the boxes to comply or to, tick everything that is required when they're writing a proposal. So I believe that if we have more flexibility for developing innovative approaches, naturally people would be more curious about what's going on out there, what has been done in a different way. If we really unleash the creativity, people would naturally seek more, share more, and instead of leveling from down, we would be trying to really differentiate what we have to offer from a more creative approach.
Thanks for that. Hopefully we have some people on our grants and proposal design team tuning in. If not, I can definitely relay that. I imagine another barrier to sharing this kind of information is just time. I think you were saying people don't seek it out, and I think you have to, I think of time in two ways. One is you have to make time to reach out to people and to get that information. And of course, that other person has to be, or organization has to be willing to share, but also the timing of the data that comes in. I think from, as I started this conversation, I mentioned that one of my primary roles at BHA is to measure, or is to manage the Impel Award, which is measuring results of our development awards. And sequencing, getting that information at the evaluation results at a time that could be useful for future program planning, be it emergency or development, is a challenge. And there are extensions given, there are delays for reasons. So timing, I think, can really present some hiccups. Let's talk a little bit about how the humanitarian community can design their program evaluations, execute the analysis, and inform programs in a longer term development context. And sitting at where I sit, I think one of the most important things that can be done is to ensure that the evaluations are designed rigorously, and that appropriate sampling strategies are used so that the evidence generated is reliable and can be trusted. Do you guys have any thoughts on on program design and evaluation design. Over.
Yeah, I've got a quick, pardon me, got a comment on this and a thought that I've had for a while that we've tried to use in different contexts, but using our monitoring data to inform evaluation design. You have, I mean, every IP has robust monitoring data. Everyone has, everyone should be tracking everything they're doing, and that should be used to inform programming in near real time. But that doesn't mean you can't aggregate it and then look at how can we use this to inform the design of the evaluation we're going to do. It doesn't have to be, like you said, that's part of our process monitoring. So I think, Mara, you said earlier, process evaluation. Well, what's better to inform a process evaluation than all the process monitoring data that you have? There is nothing better. So you have all of that accessible to you. So if you want to design, you know, a rigorous evaluation and you want to identify, you know, it's easy enough to calculate the sample sizes that you'll need, but to truly understand the population you're working with to determine what sample sizes you'll need and what you're actually looking for, you should be relying on that monitoring data to inform everything that you have, and especially the design.
I think also, since we're jumping back and forth here on humanitarian and development context, if we're striving to understand at least immediate outcomes on humanitarian interventions, we won't talk about impact. I think that's too long term for humanitarian interventions. But if we want to understand immediate outcomes rather than outputs only, then we really need to dedicate enough time to planning the interventions so that their logics are really clear, and our evaluations can then be, as you were saying, Mara, rigorous and methodologically sound, building on that sort of theory of change. If we also have a very robust theory of change, we understand and we can really place this intervention within the broad development setting as well. Really seeing how what we're building here can then inform or can enable a transition to recovery, to resilience. So I would say first and foremost, an evaluation that is enabled by strong planning, and that's not always the case. Sometimes we do what we have always been doing. We do what we think it's right, but we did not really put a lot of thought. And again, this most of the time happens because we do not have enough time to plan, and there comes preparedness into the play. But planning, and the other thing I would say is testing. So really be open to new approaches, not only in programming, but also in evaluations. On this evaluation of the social protection response to COVID, since we didn't have strong monitoring information as a baseline for outcomes results, what we decided to use to assess this immediate outcome changes throughout the intervention was the qualitative impact protocol. So I don't know if many people are familiar, but it's pretty much a robust, systematic approach to use a qualitative tool for data collection and for analysis that relies a lot on blindfolded interviews with beneficiaries to then create a connection and a link of contribution between the intervention and then effects that were perceived throughout that time. So I think just be sound, be rigorous, but also think outside the box and think what type of evidence you need and how you can do something different in order to achieve it.
Great, thanks for that. We are coming up on time, so we'll transition into the question answer part of the session. We have a few that have come in, and the first one is CHS, which is Core Humanitarian Standards, providing an increasingly common framework to use in transferring learning from emergency evaluations to development work? So is this CHS providing a common framework to use in transferring this learning. Are you guys familiar with CHS, and do you have any thoughts on this? Over.
So quite honestly, I'm not familiar enough with the framework for learning that it provides. No, I'm not. That would be more than likely our field teams that are working in those environments that would be responsible for that. But I can't speak enough to it. I don't know enough about it.
I'm in a similar situation. Fabio, what about you?
Very broad knowledge as well, but I would say that the CHS, they will definitely support as they bring standards to the planning of these interventions. Then they make it easier if you use this framework of indicators of results, of ways to measure. It makes it easier to compare across different contexts. If you're talking about same themed evaluations, and when it relates to learning and bridging to development, I'm not sure because I don't know how aligned they are to other frameworks, such as the SDGs, for example, that could be a longer term kind of framework for us to understanding results and also certain goals.
Thanks. And is there anybody on the line who's called in that wants to speak to the CHS framework and if it's evolving in such a way that's going to help transfer learning? We'll give a moment for anybody to hop off mute and chime in. Okay, and another question was, are other actors finding that the emergency development distinction is blurred in many contexts, or at least it's a continuum, and thus allowing emergency evaluations to be directly useful as we transition to longer term development type activities? So to repeat, are other actors finding that emergency development situations are blurring and allowing emergency evaluations to be directly useful as we transition? So again, I think this kind of gets back to the question of how have emergency evaluations been used, especially in those contexts where maybe there's proximate programming of emergency and development programming, or intentional layering of a development program on top of areas where there was a recurrent crisis. Fabio, Gary, if you have anything to add, please jump off mute. Otherwise, anybody from the audience who wants to opine and maybe share some examples that they're aware of or that they've actually programmed in to this. So Gary, actually both of you hopped off mute. Wow, that's great. All right, let's start with Gary. Over.
Yeah, the example I was going to provide is for our for follow-on awards, similar. The same or similar programming in a sequential year. That's something where does emergency development, situations are blurring together? Is that that was the question, correct? Yeah. So in that respect, where we have follow-on awards, the situations remain the same, but we are trying to use, I guess, what's the right way to put this? We are trying to use those data from the previous award to improve programming in the sequential award. That's the whole purpose of it. Is it blurring together? I don't know that I would say it's blurring together, but it's definitely providing an opportunity more than it is a hindrance for us.
And Gary, are you speaking about programming that's emergency to emergency, or emergency that's feeding into something that's a little bit more
emergency
longer
to emergency
term?
Yep, sorry. Okay. Emergency to emergency.
Okay.
In terms of emergency to development, I don't think I have an example for that one, but emergency to emergency, we definitely do. And that is the case where those evaluations are being used to inform the following year's programming.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
Good.
Fabio.
Helpful.
No, I think also the whole theme of this conversation, right? So humanitarian development, peace nexus is a statement that we need to see these more as a continuum, but also that has overlaps. And it's not just clear cut. You have an emergency and then you have a development situation. I think we also touched upon this this question when we were discussing how it's not a sequence of interventions when you're responding to a humanitarian setting as well. Some things you need to plan way in advance, thinking ahead of how you're doing recovery and resilience building. And to take the example of the humanitarian situation we have here in the northern part of Mozambique, where more and more evidence points towards the cause of the conflict to be insatisfaction of the population and socioeconomic conditions. This is a great way to then bring information from evaluations about the humanitarian response to identify what are the vulnerabilities being experienced by this population, what are the coordination mechanisms, how are the systems in place to address these needs. And since we're identifying the cause for a disruption in peace to be something that needs to be addressed by development in a longer term approach in interventions, then I would say for sure the evidence from this emergency evaluation will feed into the development type activities. It's very clear, and it's not even just a continuum, but it's kind of a feedback. If we don't use it, we won't end the emergency itself.
Okay, thank you for that. What about anybody from the audience? Any examples of this transitional programming, if you will? I recognize some people who attended. I could just call on you. I won't do that though. Next question. In humanitarian settings, we almost exclusively do evaluations or studies at the participant level, while in development, it's done at the population level. Would you say the data and findings from humanitarian evaluations is still applicable or can be used to inform designs of development programs in similar contexts? So I think my response to that would be, through the Impel Award, we are doing a lot of impact evaluations. And so we are collecting data from beneficiaries or those who are expected to be beneficiaries. So it's a little bit of a shift from our prior approach, where we were collecting from anybody in the village, you know, who typically met a certain criteria, to make sure that we had enough women and children under 5 represented in our surveys. So we've been shifting and taking it down a level to a little closer to the implementation. But that said, the question was, would you say that data and findings from humanitarian evaluations is still applicable or can be used to inform design? Yeah, so I think given our shift, for sure, you know, humanitarian evaluations are typically looking at participant level, and we on the development side are shifting to that too. Gary and Fabio, do you have any examples where you've that you're aware of where population level data has that you guys have fed into a program that tends to look at data at a higher level or less specific level at the population?
So we have examples from populations of governorates, where we have blanket distributions. I absolutely think that that can be used, and especially the sampling frame is definitely enough where you can design and calculate a sample size that is representative of that governorate population. So you absolutely could. One of the things that, so yeah, it absolutely can be, but this goes back again to how are you going to design this and what's available. In this particular case, we have blanket distribution, so it touches everyone in a given area. So that's an opportunity right there. If you're going to be designing and conducting an evaluation on a population in a humanitarian setting, that's a blanket distribution, you can absolutely incorporate some kind of module in those data collection instruments that could inform development programming down the road. You absolutely can collect the requisite data to inform those, but that again just goes right back to design. So the opportunities do present itself. I completely understand where the person who asked the question is coming from, but yeah, the opportunities are not as often. They don't come up as often in the humanitarian context, but they do exist. And excuse me. And then it just comes back to how you design and how you carry out your evaluation.
I also would say there's something about taking information that comes from an evaluation that was rigorously done and using that as sort of a foundation for thinking, right? Like maybe you may not think like, oh, this is so specific to this population and we're getting data, or we're looking at a different level of data for our next program, but there's still going to be some synergies and common themes that are at least worth exploring as you think about programming your development award. Fabio, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add there too.
I think another opportunity is also when we are, especially on process evaluations or when we're trying to address efficiency and analyze systems in place, especially when we're building on government systems to deliver these interventions. Even if we collect specific information at a population level, we are assessing the system as a whole, and then whatever learnings, lessons from these evaluations can be implemented and put into place, and in practice in a future humanitarian situation. So I don't think that I think this question comes from the perspective of external validity of the findings. And I don't think that's always a limitation when we want to extract the lessons, the findings from humanitarian evaluations and transport them to think in development programs.
Great. Any comments from the audience on this? Does anybody want to engage? All right, if not, our last question, any reflections on what could be improved in the overall systems processes of aid in the country at a practical level to better facilitate cross-pillar coordination of evidence and learning? Wow, I feel like that's a mouthful. Let me do it again. Any reflections on what could be improved in the overall systems processes of aid in the country at a practical level to better facilitate cross-pillar coordination of evidence and learning? Perhaps put another way, what could change in MEL evaluations to produce evaluations to ensure the data can be transferable? Fabio, Gary, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, my first question would be, which country? So it's definitely country specific, but I do think across the board, the time constraints that often occur within a humanitarian context, and especially with humanitarian programming and the preparation for evaluation, the first thing would be, I don't think it needs to change. I just think the preparation needs to happen earlier. Preparation, planning, and design have to happen as early as possible. And again, there's limitations to that, but across the board, what could change universally? I really don't know. Maybe increased IP and donor coordination at project kickoff to discuss these things, because oftentimes I think it's a lack of communication and planning that ultimately results in rushed evaluation and rushed design. But I genuinely don't know of anything that could work uniformly across the board that would make a lasting impact. I think the country context is crucial to planning those things.
Yeah, I would say if the country has type of a cluster coordination schemes, this can be used to think in advance what are the evidence needs that could benefit all those in that thematic area into better planning, and also as a space for sharing whatever has been identified throughout evaluations. I think the use of reference groups as well for each evaluation, kind of trying to make them as diverse as possible, not only within the organization, but also bringing stakeholders from different organizations that were involved in their intervention, or they may have a high stakes on what is being discussed, that can really help to better communicate evaluation and planning. But also I think at well, not at the IP level, but at the donor level, or the UN agencies or the government level, having more clarity and improved coordination, I think it would be very, very interesting as well to understand what are the frameworks, what are the conditions that are being put for those who are generating the evidence. So if we agree on some sort at a country level, if we agree on some sort of framework for what means a quality evaluation, what are some sort of the standards and the criteria or approaches that we want to use, what are the mechanisms for sharing, this can make a lot easier as well the work at a more practical level at an IPs or those the consultants that are doing evaluations.
You said something, Fabio, that I want to double back on. You mentioned the cluster or the groups that are in country for emergency response. And I wonder, were you kind of suggesting there that there could be a crowdsourcing of crowdsourcing of evaluation ideas? Were you kind of saying people would come together, talk about, okay, if it's the WASH cluster or the nutrition cluster, you know, either coming up with some sort of coordinated
sure.
evaluation plan.
For sure, and I think we miss a lot of opportunities. I mean, evaluations, especially if we're talking about impact evaluations, they're expensive, and also at the same time, it's quite hard to mobilize all of these things to then assess the contribution of your intervention on this broad setting of interventions and factors that are contributing to this impact. So in a way, if we pull in interest and resources of multiple organizations, agents that were all contributing with their own interventions to achieve the same goal, because we are aiming for the same goal. So if we're able to come together, we can, I would say it would be way easier to finance these evaluations and to have an evaluation that really understand what is the key contribution of each of us. Of course, this may backfire for some that then find out that they're not contributing at all, or someone is doing a great contribution. But I mean, let's go back to the perspective of learning and let's find out how we can together be more efficient and more effective.
Thoughts from the audience? All right, I think that we can close with the Q&A and let's talk about key takeaways from today. And I would invite people from the audience to just write in the chat box things that struck you today as important and important to the overall conversation of using humanitarian evaluations and that evidence to inform the future development and peace programming. So please drop some thoughts in the chat box. I saw a comment up there along as we were discussing sort of about beating the fear of failure, and Fabio talked about that. And to be candid, before this event, the three of us and some folks from Ideal and HIAC were huddling and talking about just that, and how maybe we need to, reframe how we look at evaluations, and all of us consciously talk about them in a way of learning, and less so about failure, less so about being judged. And I think, everybody's ego, organizational egos, self-egos get involved, but I think we really, to advance our responses, the quality of our responses and the effects and impacts of our responses, we need to know what doesn't work just as much as we need to know what works. And so I think that would be one of my key takeaways is reframing evaluations so that they're less scary, especially as we move into, as we have with Impel, as we are with HIAC, impact evaluations. And I'd like to note that also keeping in mind that while we look at impact and while causal attribution is a part of impact evaluations, it's not always perhaps appropriate to look at, what was my contribution, my organization's contribution to this effort. It could be a much smaller piece that we look at, what is the impact of a particular intervention, as opposed to the whole shebang, which in an emergency setting, may not be as useful of an angle to use. Gary, Fabio, any other key takeaways that you wanna raise here? Over.
Sure. Yeah, just that the key takeaway that I got out of today is that it is absolutely possible for humanitarian evaluation to feed into development design. It absolutely is. And there are barriers to that, but they're not insurmountable. And I'd say it all starts with improved coordination, and that's across IPs within your partnering organizations, within from IP to donor, within donor to government, and of course the humanitarian working groups or any different support organizations that exist at a regional or higher level. And frankly, don't be afraid to get creative with evaluation design. Like, not only just fear of failure, but we're not just trying to check a box. We actually want to learn what's going on here. And I shared with the team earlier, all of us that are up here, that I have encountered times where, some of our implementation teams have been very unhappy with the outcomes of some evaluations, and it happens. All right. If I'm way more suspect of an evaluation that says everything has been perfect, there's nothing to improve on, it was great, that's impossible. It's just impossible. There is no way that there's no challenges with implementation. That is an impossibility. So I think that it's more about, better coordination and just get creative. We all have big brains. Let's put them to use, and do some stuff that's cool and actually try to learn from it. So.
Fabio, any closing thoughts before I pass back to Christy?
I was gonna say, I hope I'm not the last one to speak on takeaways, and that people from the audience can actually jump in as well. But I think it becomes clear to me that we need to have an improved connection between the humanitarian development and peace context when planning, and that planning for the theory of change. So finding this internal soundness that then allows for a very interesting evaluation that really focus on the key points that we need to learn from, but also planning that connects with the future steps and creates this HDP coherence. I would say that we have opportunities, for example, if we have this framework very clear in our minds of how the intervention fits in this broad context of how the evidence then fits and can inform, we can align the recommendations of evaluations to inform future actions. We can make sure that if we have evaluation management responses, so these documents that then are formal way that the organization uses to plan its future actions to the recommendations, that they are also very clear on how the organization positions itself and moves from what has learned in the emergency to how it then plans future actions that can be more sustainable, create improved resilience.
I think that's actually a really good point, Fabio, that it could become one of the evaluation questions. Is it ready to transition? How do you transition? What will be effective for future development programming? On that note, Christy, we're going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Mara. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, especially Mara, Fabio, and Gary for this really fascinating discussion and sharing these valuable insights. Really useful to hear how and why we should share learnings across the development humanitarian context. We're almost at time though, but before we let you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this session so we can improve on our future events. We're going to share a short survey in the chat. Should take you fewer than 2 minutes to complete. And this event concludes our second thematic area as part of Ideal's knowledge sharing series. Next up will be a thematic area on communication and coordination for HDP Coherence. So please join us on August 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and you'll find the link to register in the chat. And later in August, join us as we explore sequencing, layering, and integrating humanitarian development and peace assistance. These last sessions will open up for registration in about a few weeks' time, so please follow us on the FSN network to receive news and updates about these events. We'll keep this meeting open and play some music in the background as you complete the survey. But thank you again very much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.